policies shift as the administration changes.
আমি
If
বলবো
the
না তো তুই
internal
আসলে
attributes are not significant, then why
কেউই শুনবে
such
না এর কথা
scenario is observed? These were the two particular puzzles that could not be answered by Kenneth Walls. As Walls cannot explain this, we see the formulation of balance of threat theory. Shahriar, আপনি kindly একটু accept করে নিয়েন যারা এখন add হবে. So what is balance of threat? So in article uh, economic rebalancing is an article on Chinese foreign policy. In that particular article, it was suggested that weak states do not confront powerful nation. Rather, they rebalance their economy. For example, in case of China, when China achieved the most favored nation status from United States in late 1970s, it started to open up its economy. The way China has grown is uh, economic scope. So সবাই এখনো অ্যাডমিট হচ্ছেন, it's quite distracting. Okay, so when China achieved the most favored nation status, it started to grow economically, and it gradually developed its military power. Right now we see that even in different cases, China is trying to project its military power. However, at initial stage, we have seen that they were more focused on economic development rather than having any other aspect. So China at that time always described its policy as peaceful development. Now here comes the balance of threat theory. So before understanding the concept of balance of threat theory, we have to understand certain historical background. So during the First and Second World War, the coalition of states defeated Germany, even though the combined resources of the coalition surpassed Germany's resources. So at that time, the history of First World War and Second World War, the way it happened. At that time, we have seen that number of countries, Britain, France, and later on the United States also joined. All of those countries combinedly tried to prevent the rise of Germany. However, in reality, Germany was, if you consider power as a parameter, comparing to that, Germany was a far weaker party in front of the combined resources of all those powers. However, even though Germany was a far weaker country in terms of power, we have seen that those powerful nations created coalition against Germany. Then why they did so? This is a question. Another thing is, coalition took Germany as a threat despite Germany being an inferior power. At the beginning of the Cold War era, USA emerged as a dominant and influential power comparing to Soviet Union. However, the European nations made alliance with USA by perceiving Soviet Union as the threat. So we have seen that immediate after the end of the Second World War, we have seen that United States emerged as a very dominant power. Why? At that time, United States acquired a nuclear weapon, and at that time, Soviet Union didn't have nuclear weapon. So, comparing to the point of having nuclear weapon, United States had the monopoly over nuclear power. And even though United States was a far greater power, we have seen the Western European nations were making alliance with United States instead of Soviet Union, and they were afraid of Soviet Union. Then why they were taking Soviet Union as a threat when Soviet Union was far weaker than United States? Another thing is, in both world wars, coalition of states defeated Germany, and it was about balancing the aggressive intention of Germany, not power. So here comes our very primary concept of balance of threat. that states not necessarily always balance the power. Rather, sometimes they balance the matter of threat. And this is what Stephen Walt has talked about. So these issues were addressed by Stephen Walt in his book, Origins of Alliances. The book was published in 1987. And in that particular book, he has coined the term balance of threat theory, which was introduced by Walt as another variant of structural realism. So it is one kind of structural realism, but it kind of rectified the shortcoming that was posed by Walesian framework. That previously Walz has talked about balancing power only, and right now Walt is saying that power is obviously a factor to balance. However, it is not necessarily always the power. Rather, there is matters related to threat also. Sometimes states take actions to balance against threat rather than power. Walz only focused on power, where Walt has broadened his focus beyond power. Although the distribution of power is extremely important, but the level of power is also influenced by geographical proximity, aggregate power, offensive capability, and aggressive intention. So Walt is agreeing with Waltz that yes, indeed, power is extremely important, but there are certain other factors which also has very significant claim to be balanced in international scenario. So those factors are, there are four factors that are mentioned by Stephen Walt in his Origins of Alliances book. One is geographical proximity, another one is aggregate power, third is offensive capability, and fourth is aggressive intention. Now, what is aggregate power? In general, aggregate power is the sum of population, technological capability, and military prowess. That means all kind of resources, the sum of all kind of resources are understood as aggregate power, according to Stephen Walt. And in that case, considering all else equal, the greater state's total resources, the greater potential threat it can pose. So it is a statement by Stephen Walt that if you consider all other factors as equal among two opponents, the greater state's total resources, the greater potential threat it can pose. That means if a state has higher level of aggregate power, it has the possibility that it will be a greater threat. That means what are the sources of threat? Aggregate power can be a source of threat. That means whenever we see a country with a high level of resources, with greater level of resources, we often can assume that that kind of resources, possession of that kind of resources can act as a source of threat. Now, let's just elaborate. We can understand it more clearly when we look into Walter Lippmann and George Kennan's idea that the aim of America's grand strategy will be that no state can control as industrial resources as USA. USA should maintain its aggregate power. Why they are focusing on aggregate power? Because the more USA will have aggregate power, it will have much more capability, and also other weaker state will take USA as their threat. So USA can be considered as threat to some other rival nations considering its aggregate power. However, having aggregate power itself has lots of advantages, and this is why Walter Lippmann and George Kennan has focused that there should be no other country other than United States to have the highest level of aggregate power, so that it cannot act as a source of threat for United States. So, have you understood that point? Anyone?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, why USA wanted to control most of the industrial resources. So that no other country can have as much aggregate power as United States, as aggregate power is a source of threat. Okay, so in First World War, we have seen dual alliance was created by Germany and Austria, and therefore Britain created ATAT with France and Russia. We have seen series of agreements happened from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, and that built up dual alliance between Germany and Austria. And also simultaneously, as Germany and Austria was becoming more close to tackle that, Britain took initiatives to create triple attack with France and Russia. If Britain remains silent, it would fall under the subordination of German domination. That is why Britain created ATAT. Now, look into the aggregate amount of resources that could be controlled by Germany and Austria. That would obviously surpass Britain's aggregate power. This is why in order to balance that kind of aggregate power, Britain balanced by creating alliance with France and Russia, so that they can balance against the total aggregate power of the dual alliance of Germany and Austria. So Germany was controlling more industrial resources than others. So Britain established ATAT to balance Germany's aggregate resources. So this is how aggregate resources can be a source of threat, which can push states towards balancing behavior. Second reason is geographical proximity. So the level of threat declines with distances. Aggregate power can be equal, but it can be the geographical proximity. So you will be more, any kind of state will feel more threatened by its immediate neighbor rather than its distant neighbor. So even if a particular state has substantial level of aggregate power, it may not be a source of threat. Rather, it could be the geographical proximity, which will be more concerning for any state. So states that are nearby are more threatening than the states which are far away. So let's look into this example that will clarify it more. Before the outbreak of the First World War, Germany blamed British press for highlighting the naval power expansion of Germany, where Brazil's expansion and development of naval power remained unnoticed. So see what happened during the First World War. Germany was building up its naval power, and it was kind of competing with British naval force. So at that time, the British press, they were more highlighting the development that was happening in Germany. However, simultaneously, at that time, Brazil was also developing its own naval power, but it was not a matter of media attention. Why? Because Brazil was not a threat to Britain. Because if you look into the geographical proximity, the matter of geographical proximity, Brazil is far away from Britain. Rather, Germany is its closest neighbor. It is within its neighborhood. So obviously, whatever Germany is doing is going to be a more harmful, is going to have more harmful effect on Britain rather than um, any kind of action of Brazil. So this is why geographical proximity can act as a source of threat. That often we see uh, states that are situated at distant places may not act as a threat. Rather, our closest neighbor may act as a source of threat, as they are uh, situated in nearby and they have the capability to strike against us. So this is the idea of geographical proximity. So America reacted against the establishment of missile bases in Cuba, as it is a geographically contagious space. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? When did it happen? What was the year? Cuban Missile Crisis.
62.
1962. So what happened? Why America was so reactive about Cuban missile crisis? Because Soviet Union was investing to create missile bases in Cuba, and Cuba is geographically contiguous to United States. It is maybe within the 90 miles of Florida. So this is obviously due to the geographical proximity that Cuba, being a small nation, a weak power, became a source of threat for the United States. Why? Because it was geographical proximity and the way Soviet Union was involved in Cuba. Another example can be given is Indira Doctrine. Remember the Indira Doctrine? It is not an official doctrine, but it was established in 1970s. And it is one kind of India's Monroe Doctrine, or India's interpretation of Monroe Doctrine, which is uh, establishing India's sphere of influence. And based on this doctrine, we have seen that in 1980s, Indian forces were deployed in Sri Lankan civil war. So you may remember that Sri Lanka has gone through a long 40 years of civil war from 1980s, and it lasted till 2009. Uh, so in that particular context, we have witnessed that Indian forces were deployed to tackle the situation in Sri Lanka. That was also kind of to establish the idea of India's sphere of influence. Now, the third is offensive capabilities. Now, all else being equal, that means what are the all else being equal? The aggregate power, the geographical proximity, um, the offensive, um, the aggressive intention. So all those factors, if all those factors remain equal, that means neutral, states with offensive capability poses as great threat. That means sometimes aggregate power may not work as a source of threat. Geographical proximity may not work as a source of threat. However, offensive capability can
Jodhila
also
একটা
work
story
as
দিছে
a source of threat. So aggregate power can often be transformed into
I love you,
offensive
my
capability.
BBYP.
For example, during 1990s, early 2000s, we have seen that China was focused on developing on its economic front. But right now, what we are seeing, we are observing that China is also investing in its military structure, military infrastructure. So, if you remember, China has produced its 1.5 war doctrine.
ডক্টর
Uh, it,
Husband?
the People's Liberation Army is investing
What?
in a
ও
um,
Nice.
is
হাতের
investing to
লেখাটা দেখে মনে হলো
provide
ডক্টর
a thorough military plan. So this is how they are transforming towards this military development. So they are basically, they have aggregate power, they have the population, they have the resources, they have all kind of industrial outputs that they have developed so far, and now they are converting those resources towards military sectors. So this is how countries with greater aggregate power always can convert those resources towards developing offensive capabilities. So offensive capability indicates a situation where a state has the capability to pose threat to the territorial integrity of other states. North Korea may lack aggregate power. If you look into the North Korean economy, it is a very poor economy. It is a very weak nation in terms of its industrial output. Uh, However, the reality is, even though they lack substantial amount of aggregate power, they convert their limited resources to develop offensive capability. Even though they have small amount of resources, they convert those towards building up nuclear weapons, missiles. That means this is where offensive capability comes as a threat. This is why North Korea is a threat for United States. It is the offensive capability, even though in terms of power, North Korea is a smaller nation. However, if you consider the offensive capability, the way they are, even though they lack aggregate power, they are converting their limited resources towards building up those offensive capability. That kind of action is a source of threat. And this is why United States try to balance that threat. So geographical proximity is also working in case of North Korea, as Guam Island is near to North Korea. You remember Guam Island is a very important island of strategic significance for United States, and which is also geographically near to North Korea. So there is both kind of dimension which is working as a threat for United States. One is geographical proximity, another one is offensive capability related to North Korea. Finally, aggressive intention. All else being equal, aggressive intention may matter. That means Iran lacks aggregate power, but it has aggressive intention. So we often see that Iranians are giving slogans, especially after 1979, when the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran. We have seen that greater level of anti-American sentiment among the general Iranians. And at that time, they have given this kind of slogans like "Death to America." And this kind of slogans, even though they do not have any aggregate power, even though they do not have any offensive capability, but they have this intention which is aggressive. So that can also work as a threat. That means even if a state do not have sufficient level of resources, even though it is not geographically contagious, even though it does not have the offensive capability, but it can be only the aggressive intention will be sufficient to balance against that threat. So Iran's support for Hezbollah and Houthis in Yemen, that also reflect aggressive intention. So these four dimensions can work as sources of threat, and often we see that states not only just balance power, rather states also try to react against this kind of threats. So this is so far Stephen Wald's balance of threat theory. Do you have any question or confusion, or do you need any clarification?
ম্যাম,
জি,
অফেন্সিভ ক্যাপাবিলিটিস বলতে কি শুধু মিলিটারি অ্যাকশনকেই বোঝায়?
হ্যাঁ, মিলিটারি হতে পারে, আবার আপনার বিভিন্ন ধরনের সাইবার ক্রাইমও হতে পারে, যেটা আপনার ক্ষতি করতে পারে, আপনার স্টেটের ইনফ্রাস্ট্রাকচারাল ক্ষতি করতে পারে, যে কোনো ক্ষতি হতে পারে। সেটা আপনার দেখা গেল আপনার ব্যাংকিং সিস্টেমকে হ্যাক করে ফেললো, এটাও তো একটা অফেন্সিভ ক্যাপাবিলিটি।
ওকে ম্যাম, থ্যাংক ইউ।
তো ডিফারেন্ট ফ্রন্টেই হতে পারে। এনি আদার কোয়েশ্চেন?
ম্যাম, আমার জাস্ট একটা থট ছিল যে আমরা যখন এই ব্যালেন্স অফ থ্রেট থিওরিটার দিকে যাচ্ছি, একটা কনস্ট্রাকটিভিস্ট আইডিয়া থেকে চিন্তা করলে এটা রিয়ালিজমের বাহিরে বের হয়ে আসতেছে না অনেকটা? মানে when we think about threats, কে আমার থ্রেট হবে বা কে থ্রেট হবে না, এটা অনেকটাই একটা মানে পার্সন টু পার্সন বা স্টেট টু স্টেট ভ্যারি করে। মানে লেটস সে মিডল ইস্টে ইসরায়েল এক্সিস্ট করতেছে, ইরানও এক্সিস্ট করতেছে, বাট দুইজনেরই ক্যাপাবিলিটি, ইনফ্যাক্ট ইসরায়েলের ক্যাপাবিলিটি বেটার, বাট আমি ইউএসএ হিসেবে ইরানকে হচ্ছে থ্রেট হিসেবে ধরে নিচ্ছি। এন্ড হ্যাঁ, এখন হয়তো ইরান অনেক প্রক্সিকে সাপোর্ট করছে, বাট ইরানে যখন মানে ইসলামিক রেভলিউশনটা হইলো তখন থেকে আমি, বিফোর দে ডিড এনিথিং, তখন থেকেই আমি ওদেরকে থ্রেট হিসেবে ধরে রাখতেছি বিকজ অফ সিম্পলি বিকজ অফ দ্য রিলিজিয়াস বিলিফ অথবা বিকজ অফ আদার মানে কালচারাল স্টাফ। সো ওই সেন্সটা থেকে এই মানে থিওরিটা অনেকটা রিয়ালিজমের বাইরে চলে আসে না? দিস ইজ হোয়াট আই থিংক।
স্টিফেন ওয়াল্ট যখন দিয়েছে, স্টিফেন ওয়াল্ট রিয়েলিজমের ভেতর থেকেই দিয়েছে, কিন্তু there is always a constructivist dimension. So constructivism obviously will point out that how you are perceiving threat. ওয়াল্ট এখানে স্পেসিফিক্যালি বলে দিচ্ছে যে these forces can work as sources of threat. তার মানে যখন আপনার অপোনেন্ট আপনার জিওগ্রাফিক্যালি আপনার কাছে থাকবে, নেইবারহুডে থাকবে, তখন আপনার জন্য থ্রেট হতে পারে। আহ, এটা ওয়ার্ল্ডের ক্ষেত্রে ওয়ার্ল্ড হচ্ছে ব্রডার ওয়েতে বলছে, কিন্তু আপনি যদি ডিপলি চিন্তা করেন তাহলে তো আসলে হাউ ইউ আর ডিটারমাইনিং দ্যাট দিস ইজ ইয়োর থ্রেট। কারণ আমার নেইবারহুডে সবাই তো আমার থ্রেট না। ব্রিটেনের জন্য তো ফ্রান্স থ্রেট না, ব্রিটেনের জন্য তাহলে কেন জার্মানি থ্রেট হলো? তো তখন আপনি কোয়েশ্চেন করতে পারেন যে ওয়াই ইট ইজ হ্যাপেনিং। ওই কোয়েশ্চেনটা তো কেউ করেনি। স্টিফেন ওয়াল জাস্ট সিম্পলি বলেছে যে দিস কুড বি দ্য পসিবল সোর্সেস অফ থ্রেট ফ্রম আ রিয়েলিস্ট পয়েন্ট অফ ভিউ। কারণ ওই কোয়েশ্চেনটা চলে আসছে যে সবসময় পাওয়ার কাজ করে না, পাওয়ারের ডাইনামিকটা কাজ করে না, মাঝে মাঝে ইট ইজ অ্যাবাউট থ্রেট। তো ওইটাকে রেকটিফাই করার জন্য স্টিফেন বল দিয়েছে। স্টিফেন বল কিন্তু কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজমের দিকে আর আসেনি। কিন্তু আপনি কনস্ট্রাকটিভিস্ট পয়েন্ট অফ ভিউ থেকে কোয়েশ্চেন করতে পারেন যে তাহলে হাউ ইউ আর ডিটারমাইনিং that particular state is your threat. It depends on the interaction, right? The intersubjective identity that is built based on your interaction. আপনি যেভাবে আপনার নেইবারের সাথে ইন্টারঅ্যাক্ট করবেন, তখন যদি আপনি দেখেন যে আপনার প্যাটার্ন অফ বিহেভিয়ার ইজ কোঅপারেটিভ, তাহলে আপনি তার সাথে কোঅপারেশন করবেন, তাকে ফ্রেন্ড ভাববেন। যদি দেখেন যে প্যাটার্ন অফ ইন্টারাকশন ইজ কম্পিটিটিভ এবং দেখা যাচ্ছে আপনার নেইবার কোয়াইট অ্যাগ্রেসিভ টুয়ার্ডস ইউ, তখন ইউ আর গোয়িং টু টেক মোর অ্যাগ্রেসিভ অ্যাকশনস। So it is all about the way you are interacting, and that interaction is determining that who is your threat and who is not. That could be a point of view from constructivism, but from realist point of view they are exactly pointing out that these are the broader uh, titles which could be sources of threat. Realism আপনার সারফেস লেভেল থেকে বলছে this is why these are problem solving theories. কারণ ওয়ালস এর থিওরি একটা প্রবলেম ক্রিয়েট করছে, ওয়াল্ট কিন্তু এটা স্টিফেন ওয়াল্ট ইজ ট্রাইং টু রেকটিফাই ইট, ইজ ট্রাইং টু রিজলভ ইট। সেটাও কিন্তু আপনার রিয়েলিস্ট পয়েন্ট অফ ভিউ থেকে। স্টিফেন ওয়াল কিন্তু বলেন যে এটা কিন্তু ইন্টারঅ্যাকশনের বেসিসে হচ্ছে। রাদার স্টিফেন ওয়াল কি বলছে যে অ্যাগ্রিগেট পাওয়ার বেশি থাকলে থ্রেট হতে পারে, আমার নেইবারহুডের ভেতর থাকলে থ্রেট হতে পারে। তো স্টিফেন ওয়াল কিন্তু ডিপে যাচ্ছে না যে ইজ ইট অ্যাবাউট দ্য ইন্টারঅ্যাকশন, ইজ ইট অ্যাবাউট দ্য ইন্টারসাবজেক্টিভ আইডেন্টিটি, সেটা স্টিফেন ওয়াল বলছে না। সেটা আপনি বলতে পারেন যে ইন্টারসাবজেক্টিভ আইডেন্টিটির কারণে এই 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 পারসেপশনটা ক্রিয়েট হচ্ছে। কিন্তু স্টিফেন ওয়াল্টের পয়েন্ট অফ ভিউ ওয়াজ পিওরলি ফ্রম রিয়েলিজম।
আচ্ছা, বুঝতে পেরেছি ম্যাম। তাহলে এটা একটা ক্রিটিসিজম হতে পারে যে ও মানে এই জিনিসগুলো ইয়ে করতেছে না আর কি।
হ্যাঁ, এটা আপনি ওভারঅল রিয়েলিজমের ব্যাপারেই ক্রিটিসিজম করতে পারেন। কারণ সকল রিয়েলিস্ট স্কলাররাই ভাবে যে অ্যানার্কি ইজ কনস্ট্যান্ট কন্ডিশন। কিন্তু আপনি যদি কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজমের দিক থেকে বলেন, তাহলে কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজম বলবে যে এখানে সবসময় হবজিয়ান অ্যানার্কি এক্সিস্ট করবে, সেটা না। কারণ ইট ডিপেন্ডস অন দ্য ইন্টারাকশন। আমি যদি ইন্টারাক্ট করে দেখি যে আমার নেইবার আমার প্রতি ফ্রেন্ডলি, তাহলে আমি কেন তাকে হবজিয়ান অ্যানার্কির ভেতরে ফেলবো? আমি যদি ইন্টারাক্ট করে দেখি যে সে অ্যাগ্রেসিভ, তখন না হয় আমি অ্যানার্কির ব্যাপারটা আনতে পারি। সেটা হবে কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজমের ব্যাপারে, কারণ কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজম গিভস ইউ মাল্টিপল অপরচুনিটিস, মাল্টিপল এক্সপ্লানেশনস।
জি ম্যাম, বুঝতে পেরেছি। থ্যাংক ইউ।
আপনি আরেকটু ডিপার পড়াশোনা করে দেখতে পারেন, বা আপনার যদি আরো কনফিউশন থাকে আপনি বলতেও পারেন। হ্যাঁ, এটা খানিকটা আপনি একদিক থেকে বলতে পারেন যে কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজমের একটা ভিউ পয়েন্ট চলে আসছে, তো সেটা আপনার অ্যানালাইসিসের উপরে। তো রিয়েলিস্ট পয়েন্ট অফ ভিউ থেকে সবসময় তারা একটা এক্সপ্লানেশনই দিয়ে থাকে। কারণ ওয়াল্ট কিন্তু কখনো অ্যানার্কিকে ডিনাই করে নাই। ওয়াল্ট কখনো, মানে স্টিফেন ওয়াল্টের কথা বলছি, ওয়াল্ট নেভার ডিনাইড অ্যানার্কি, ওয়াল্ট নেভার ডিনাইড দ্য প্রাইমেসি অফ নেশন স্টেটস। তো সেই ক্ষেত্রে আপনি বলতে পারেন না যে ওয়াল্ট হচ্ছে কনস্ট্রাকটিভিস্ট। কিন্তু একজন কনস্ট্রাকটিভিস্ট হিসেবে আপনি বলতে পারেন যে রাদার অ্যানার্কি ইটসেলফ ইজ আ কন্টেস্টেড কনসেপ্ট। কারণ অ্যানার্কি ইটসেলফ ইজ নট দ্য অনলি অপশন। নানান ধরনের ভার্সন হতে পারে অ্যানার্কির, এবং সাইমালটেনিয়াসলি থ্রেটেরও নানান ধরনের ভার্সন হতে পারে, এবং টোটালি ডিপেন্ডস অন দ্য ইন্টারঅ্যাক্টিভ প্যাটার্ন অ্যান্ড দ্য ওয়ে উই আর ক্রিয়েটিং ইন্টারসাবজেক্টিভ আইডেন্টিটি। সেটা কিন্তু ওয়াল্টে আসেনি। বোঝা গিয়েছে?
জি ম্যাম, বুঝতে পেরেছি।
তবে
Thank you.
আপনি চাইলে এটা কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজম অ্যাঙ্গেল আনতে পারেন। আপনি বলতে পারেন যে it is kind of a departure from core realist view, as it is talking about threat, and threat itself has to be perceived based on identity. এখান থেকে আপনি বলতে পারেন যে identity is defining the interest. হতে পারে, কোনো প্রবলেম নেই। ইফ ইউ ক্যান গিভ দ্যাট অ্যাঙ্গেল, তাহলে তো মানে একেবারে এ প্লাস পাওয়ার মতো খাতা, যে ইউ আর পারসিভিং দিস থিওরি অ্যান্ড দেন ইউ আর কারেক্টলি পয়েন্টিং আউট দোজ অ্যাঙ্গেলস। ভালো। শাহরিয়ারের মতো কনফিউশন আর কারো আছে? আর কারো মনে হয়েছে যে স্টিফেন ওয়াল্টের কন্ট্রিবিউশন মোর টুয়ার্ডস কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজম? সবাই কি ঘুমাচ্ছেন? রোল কল করার সময় সবাই থাকবেন আমি জানি। এখন কেউ নাই? তাহলে অ্যাটেন্ডেন্স আমি শুধু শাহরিয়ারকে দিব, আপনারা সবাই অ্যাবসেন্ট থাকবেন।
What the fuck? Where is your Sharia love stemming from, girl? উনি নাকি খালি শারিয়ারে অ্যাটেন্ডেন্স দিবার করে দিবেন।
কাজী তাপতিলা,
Yes, miss.
বুঝেছেন ব্যালেন্স অফ থ্রেট?
জি মিস।
আপনি কি শাহরিয়ারের সাথে এগ্রি করেন না বা ডিসএগ্রি করেন?
শুনি
হ্যাঁ, আমি অবশ্যই এগ্রি করি।
এগ্রি করেন, আচ্ছা। তাহলে আপনার এক্সপ্লেনেশনটা কি? স্টিফেন ওয়াল্টের আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিংটা কি মোর টুয়ার্ডস কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজম নাকি রিয়েলিজম?
আমার কাছে মনে হয় এটা কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজমের দিকে মানে বেশি লেগে।
কেন?
আমি আমি অ্যাকচুয়ালি এটা ক্লিয়ারলি আমি আসলে ঠিক বুঝিয়ে বলতে পারি না, তো মানে আমি আমার মনে হয়েছে আর কি।
আচ্ছা, কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজম মানে কি? আপনি কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজম বলতে কি বুঝেন? কনস্ট্রাকটিভিজম বলতে কি বুঝেন? কাজী তাপতিলা? তাহলে আপনি যে এগ্রি করলেন, আপনি তো না বুঝেই এগ্রি করলেন। Acha, later on we are going to study constructivism as a separate topic, and then those confusions will be clarified. Okay. Now our next theory is hegemonic stability theory. Stephen Kressner and Robert Gilpin introduced hegemonic stability theory. So neorealism argues that under anarchy, cooperation is not possible. As we have studied Kenneth Waltz, that Kenneth Waltz has talked about that under anarchy, cooperation is not possible, given the survival imperative which dictates that states must prioritize relative gains over absolute gains. So anarchy gives rise to collective action problem in that states must eschew collaboration in order to survive. However, hegemonic stability theory, or HST, modifies this formula, arguing that cooperation is possible, but only under a unique distribution of power, hegemonic polarity, and only for the short term. Remember, we have discussed in our previous class that Kenneth Waltz never mentioned about any hegemonic power. Rather, he has talked about a number of great powers. There are a number of great powers in the international system. However, hegemonic stability theory is saying that there could be a hegemonic unipolarity. So আপনি পার্থক্যটা বুঝতে পারছেন। কেনেথ ওয়ালস কি বলছে যে under anarchy collective action is not possible, cooperation is not possible, but hegemonic stability theory is saying that under the unipolarity of a hegemonic power, that means suppose United States of America, the sole dominant power, if in a unipolar world, if we have only one dominant power, under that power cooperation is possible. And that cooperation will not last for long time, but for short time, cooperation is possible. তো দুটো থিওরির মধ্যে পার্থক্য আপনারা বুঝতে পারছেন। এক্সামে কিন্তু আপনাদেরকে কম্পেয়ারও করতে বলা হবে যে ওয়ালজিয়ান ফিলসফির সাথে হেজিমনিক স্টেবিলিটি থিওরির কম্পেয়ার কন্ট্রাস্ট করেন, তখন কিন্তু আপনি এটা বলতে হবে যে বোথ অফ দ্য থিওরিজ আর বেসড অন অ্যানার্কিক ওয়ার্ল্ড ইন্টারন্যাশনাল স্ট্রাকচার, বাট হোয়াট ইজ দ্য পয়েন্ট অফ ডিপার্চার? ওয়ালস বলছে কোঅপারেশন ইজ নট পসিবল, আর হেজিমনিক স্টেবিলিটি থিওরি বলছে যে কোঅপারেশন ইজ পসিবল ফর শর্ট টাইম। তারপর ওয়ালস কি বলছে? there is no existence of any singular hegemonic power, but hegemonic stability theory কি বলছে? under the guidance of a hegemonic power cooperation is possible. তো এই পার্থক্যগুলো আপনারা মাথায় রাখবেন পড়ার সময়, এবং এক্সামে কিন্তু এই ওরিয়েন্টেড কোয়েশ্চেন্স আসবে।
Ma'am,
ওকে, লেটস মুভ। জি বলেন।
ma'am, in case there is a question like that, would you like us to use charts to compare and contrast between the two theories?
No, no. Don't use any chart. You have to
Okay.
write it down in paragraph, and you can provide certain points that these are the point of contrast and these are the point of agreement, but do not write down any chart or table.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So in the long run, cooperation dissolves as hegemony declines and the distribution of power inevitably shifts to multipolarity. It indicates cooperation is possible for short term. Okay, so cooperation occurs only in unique condition where hegemon exists, which has preponderance of military and economic power. That means the power who has the preeminence in terms of military and economic capability, that particular state can qualify as a hegemon. In 1970s, when multinational corporations were rising, the Marxists started to promote that this development is substantially undermining the egoistic nature of nation state. Rise of MNCs had created interdependence, and the egoist nature of nation state was undermined. Neorealism failed to explain this phenomenon, and Kressner proposed hegemonic stability theory. So in 1970s, there were series of development that was happening throughout 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, that we have seen that the way different multinational corporations were growing, and we have seen the rise of different non-state actors. So the other critical scholars, they started to criticize the mainstream realism, that realism is not able to explain that how non-state actors are rising, how the primacy of state actor is questioned. And even though realism claims that cooperation is not possible, but in reality we are observing that right now different states and non-state entity, they are cooperating. So how neorealism will explain that? So this is that point that Wallsian philosophy failed to explain. Wallsian philosophy could not explain that why MNCs or state non-state actors, why they are cooperating when in reality it was not supposed to happen. To explain that development, to explain that particular phenomenon, that why cooperation is happening, we see that Kressner has proposed this hegemonic stability theory. So Kressner and Robert Gilpin, they redefined the neorealist framework so that the interdependency can be explained, the interdependency among the states and non-state actor. So according to Kressner, hegemon is the state which has preponderance of military and economic power. So the power, the state who possesses the greater level of economic and military capability. The state who has the superiority in terms of military and economic resources, that particular state qualifies as a hegemon. So in this case, we are going to focus the role of United States as a hegemon. So according to Robert Keohane, so different scholars have defined hegemony in different ways. Kressner has defined it in terms of preponderance of military and economic power. Robert Keohane is explained that hegemony is a situation where one state is powerful enough to maintain the essential rules governing interstate relations. Again, there also another definition of regime came, that what is regime. So often we see at that time in 1970s, 80s, 90s, we have seen that development of different kind of regime. So what is a regime? It is not just any political party or any political regime, rather it is talking about the international regime that we see. Regimes can be defined as sets of implicit or explicit principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actors' expectations converge in a given area of international relations. So here, regimes mean the way states are cooperating and creating their own regime of cooperation. For example, we often talk about climate regime. What is climate regime? What is international climate regime? It indicates the principles, norms, rules related to that climate change affairs, right? So all those institutional plus normative ideas, the cluster of those ideas and institutions is basically identified as regime. So this development of regime, we have seen that from 1970s onward, that different kind of regimes were established at international level. So this is why here is the definition of regime, that what do we understand by regime? Even though that regime, that kind of interdependency and cooperation was possible, so hegemony stability theory took the task of explaining that kind of development. So at first, the theory has identified that what could be the criteria of becoming a hegemon. So a hegemon has to have 5 defining criteria, or a hegemon has to qualify these 5 uh, criteria to call itself as a hegemon. Number 1 is the leading state must have a preponderance of economic and military power. That means it has to have superior power base. Number 2, a hegemon must be a liberal state, because only liberal states have the will to pursue hegemony. Okay, so this is also based on Eurocentric idea that a liberal state, only the liberal state will have the intention to establish a cooperative regime, because an authoritarian state will prefer imperialism. That means if a state is authoritarian in nature, it will try to colonize the weaker states rather than cooperate with the and making alliance with the weaker state. So this is why liberal values are important. So the state has to be a liberal state. Moreover, only liberal states are concerned to create an open and liberal world order. Number 3 is there must be a rudimentary consensus among the major states for hegemony. That means all other major states, for example, Britain, France, Germany, all those Western powers, they must agree that yes, United States has the preponderance of power. So there should be a general level of consensus among the major power to agree the power position of United States. That a hegemon has the necessary far-sightedness to set up regimes which can enhance long-term global welfare.
What the fuck
This is the 4th criteria,
saying?
that a hegemon has
Farhana,
to have the
what the fuck is she
far-sightedness.
saying?
What is far-sightedness?
Fuck.
It
I'm
has to
asking
have,
you.
it has to be visionary
Bro.
to set up regimes and institutions which will have
Is
long-term
it just me or
global
she's just
impact.
super weird?
Number 5, a hegemon must be willing to make short-term sacrifices in order to secure long-term or collective or global benefit. So these are the
I
5
even
criteria.
liked like
Number 1 is
Tuffa
a
Tanzul Motan.
hegemon must have a superior power base. Second is A hegemon has to be a liberal
She
state
was
because
boring as well, but
only a
not this
liberal
much.
state will promote a liberal world order and will promote cooperation. Number three is there has to be rudimentary level of consensus among the other major power that they are agreeing that this particular state is hegemon. Number four is that a hegemon has to have far-sightedness to establish the regimes, which could be for long-term benefit. Number five is a hegemon must be willing to make short-term sacrifices. Now, what sort of short-term sacrifices we are talking about? So it is indicating different kind of altruistic sacrifices. So the basic function of hegemony is to overcome the collective action problem by altruistically creating and maintaining liberal international trading and monetary regimes, especially fixed exchange rates and free trade, as well as acting as the global policeman. In this process, hegemon converts the short-term relative gains preferences of state into long-term cooperative gains preferences. So hegemon has to have certain mindset to do sacrifices. What sort of sacrifices? For example, it may give up its own short-term economic benefits to promote the long-term economic cooperation. It can act as a global policeman by extending its military support towards its allies so that its allies can promote economic and political cooperation. So this is how a hegemon has to have that kind of upper hand, or it has to have that kind of intention of promoting long-term benefits or long-term goals by sacrificing its short-term benefits or profits. And why a hegemon will do that? It is simply based on that liberal value, which will guide a hegemon to promote that kind of idea. Now, US has performed the role of global policeman. This is why we are going to relate the concept of hegemonic stability theory with United States. So, United States has performed the role of global policeman as it was disproportionately superior than its allies in terms of military capability and it has offered military support to its allies. The allies were able to engage in economic development instead of military development. Just remember what happened after the Second World War. We have seen that United States has emerged as the most superior power, and the European powers who were involved in the war, they had to suffer through different kind of infrastructural damages, through economic collapses. So as they were suffering from all those crises, in the meantime, United States had the greater military capability. And as United States had the greater military capability, it extended its support. So throughout the Cold War period, we have seen that. কেউ কিছু বলবেন?
Allah.
Okay. Even throughout the Cold War, we have seen the way United States had extended its nuclear umbrella to protect the Western Europe from Soviet Union. So this is an act of global policeman. The way United States had acted to protect, to provide military support to its allies. This is an example of global policeman. Then, secondly, US accepted the asymmetrical gain with its partner. Remember, sacrificing for short-term goals. So United States did that. It has accepted the asymmetrical gain with its partner. Economic gain tilted towards its partners. Tariff was relaxed, and European and Japan's export markets flourished. So United States provided the scope and opportunity to the Europe and Japan to expand their economic front so that they do not have to occupy themselves with military capability. So United States, first of all, ensured the security, and then it has given the scope so that its allies can grow economically. Okay, so on the other hand, tariff wall was given against American goods. So throughout the Cold War era, even in 1990s, we have seen that tariff was imposed upon American goods. However, on the other hand, Japanese goods had the free access to American market. So this is a benign sacrifice from the part of United States, as USA was responsible to set up treaties and USA created liberal economic regimes. Dollar was introduced and maintained as global currency. So all those steps were taken and institutionalized from USA's end. So USA was the proactive actor to initiate those policies, to formulate those institutions. Therefore, it has accepted certain short-term losses. So USA made sacrifices in investment and aid. Marshall Aid, remember Marshall Aid? Marshall Aid was channeled to Europe after the end of the Second World War. And this sort of sacrifices created environment of cooperation and relative peace. For USA, why USA was doing this kind of altruistic sacrifices? So it was all about establishing influences. So USA was investing itself on in terms of establishing influence at different front, as it had a greater level of resources, it had superior level of power base, it was investing on influencing the rest of the world. And while influencing the rest of the world, it has accepted certain level of short-term losses in economic front. Okay. So according to hegemonic stability theory, there are two types of hegemony. One is benign hegemony. It makes altruistic sacrifices as it accepts. It is a spelling mistake. It accepts the asymmetry. For is a benign hegemon because it is doing altruistic sacrifices for long-term benefit. Second one is predatory hegemony. Hegemon only understands its own interest. It does not do any altruistic sacrifices. So the hegemon who is not driven by any liberal values is basically an example of predatory hegemony. And as USA is a benign hegemony, cooperation was possible even for short term. So hegemonic stability theory focuses on benign hegemony to explain the possibility of cooperation. However, cooperation cannot exist in the long term. So there are several reasons why cooperation cannot exist in long term. So hegemon sacrifices create some public goods. What is public good? That means benefit for general people. So whatever sacrifices a hegemon is doing, it is creating broader benefit for all nations, for its alliances, which is known as public goods, which means other gets the opportunity of free ride. Now, as the hegemon is out of goodwill, out of liberal values, a hegemon is kind of making all those altruistic sacrifices. However, that is creating a free riding condition that others are getting more benefit instead of investing anything. So this is exactly what happened, that Japan didn't have to invest in its military capability, or other European nations, they didn't have to occupy themselves in the matter of military capability or security, because United States provided them that kind of security. United States provided them the uh, open market condition. This is why what happened, they didn't have to invest anything. Right now, we see that how Trump is always focusing that other nations should also contribute in NATO, right? You see this kind of agreements, and what is the source of this agreement? This is due to the benign sacrifices that was made by United States throughout the years. This is why the other parties, United States alliances, didn't have to invest much. Rather, they gained more from United States action. So in 1990s, American car could not compete in Japanese market. However, Japanese cars took over American market. So this happened due to the policies of United States. Therefore, hegemon declines as the power gaps between a hegemon and the major power gradually declines. This happens due to free ride situation. Now you understand that United States had the superior power base. Therefore, it worked as a global policeman. It extended its security. It has provided multiple opportunity of running free market economy. So its allies, its alliances, they grew at the economic front and they became superior gradually. So as its own allies and other major power became superior in terms of its power base, the superior power base of the hegemon naturally declines. And this is where, when a hegemon's power is declining, the uh, the opportunity of cooperation is also declining. This is why only under the existence of a benign hegemon, cooperation is possible. But that cooperation will not last long, as that hegemon will decline gradually. Why it will decline? It is quite self-explanatory. As a benign hegemon is doing all kind of altruistic sacrifices, that is creating opportunity of free ride, and this free ride is giving its allies the opportunity to achieve greater power base in terms of economic development, and also sometimes they can convert those economic development towards military development. So the superior power base of the hegemon is basically start to decline, and this is where cooperation uh, may not be possible as the hegemon declines. So this is more or less the concepts related to hegemonic stability theory. There are certain obvious criticisms. Number one is hegemons must be liberal. However, core neorealism does not consider the internal attributes of a state. Remember, hegemonic stability theory is one variant of structural realism. Even though it is trying to rectify the gap of neorealism, but the core neorealism, the pure neorealism we talked about in our previous class, that does not consider internal attribute. However, hegemonic stability theory is talking about liberal values. So liberal values is part of domestic politics. So it is considering the domestic politics rather than avoiding it. Second is, hegemon must have the farsightedness. If they have the farsightedness, then why they cannot predict their own decline? This is also another criticism of hegemonic stability theory. That hegemonic stability theory is first of all assuming that a hegemon must have to have the liberal values. It must have the farsightedness to establish cooperation and institutions. So even if it really has the farsightedness, why it is providing the opportunity of free ride? Why it is not able to prevent its own decline? So this is one of the prominent criticisms. Okay, so this is what hegemonic stability theory is. First of all, you have to mention the gap. First of all, if you are you get question in your exam about hegemonic stability theory, you have to explain the historical context that in 1970s MNCs were rising and states were cooperating in a sense, and that was criticized by the Marxist scholar, and neorealism could not explain that phenomenon. And considering that gap, we have seen Krasner and Gilpin, they have redefined the neo-realist framework and provided hegemonic stability theory. And according to that theory, there are 5 conditions which a hegemon must fulfill. These are the 5 conditions. Then you have to mention that the way United States worked as a hegemon. And then you have to mention the matter related to benign hegemon and predatory hegemon. Obviously, United States is a benign hegemon. And then how hegemon declines. It declines as it creates opportunity of free ride. And the relative power gap is basically gradually starts to decline. And the cooperative mechanism that was set up by the hegemon, that also gradually declines. So this is why, according to HST, cooperation is possible, but that is also for short term. Okay? Any question?
No, ma'am.
বুঝতে পেরেছেন? বোঝা গিয়েছে?
জি ম্যাম।
আচ্ছা, কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন আছে?
1.5 ঘন্টা ভাই।
No, ma'am.
পুরো 1.5
কোয়েশ্চেন নাই?
এখন রিচিকে ধরবে।
হেজিমনিক স্টেবিলিটি থিওরি কি মানে খুব ইজি?
না, বল।
সবাই বিনাইন হেজিমনি আর প্রেডেটরি হেজিমনির মধ্যে পার্থক্য বুঝতে পেরেছেন?